iPlayer if you'd like to watch us as well as listen to us. And interesting, first Alexa message I've seen in this hour is from Kenny in Liverpool, who has a very important thing to say. He says, "Is Gavin Esler spelt E-S-L-A so I can search for the book and order it and buy it?" No, it's not. It's E-S-L-E-R. And he's with me now. Gavin, welcome to the programme.
Thank you. I like to be on with someone who can spell.
Well, and also knows the importance of buying books.
That's true.
Now, this book is, as we've said, it's called Britain is Better Than This. And it's an interesting title. Now, just set out why you wanted to write the book, what your aim was, and why give it that title.
It seemed to me, as I've been travelling around Britain for years, but particularly in the last couple of years, I've been to Shetland, to Cornwall, to Belfast, to Kent, and everywhere in between, just about. It feels like it. This is a great country. It is an amazing country. It is so beautiful. And the spark for the book came in Totnes, or near Totnes in Devon, which is Dartington Hall. 1,200 acres, medieval place.
I loved your description of it at the beginning of the book.
It's just gorgeous, isn't it, if you've been there? I walked around. I was there for a literary festival, which is something I love to do. And there were kingfishers down by the river. There were people paddling in the river, which was clean. This was a couple of years ago. I don't know how it is now. Anyway, I was sitting outside the place where I was going to be talking, which is this beautiful part of Dartington Hall. And a somewhat elderly, very posh, very lovely lady came up to me, and she reminded me so much of the Queen Mother. She was so posh. And she said to me, "Excuse me, do you mind if I ask you a question?" And I said, "No." And I was slightly worried about where this was going. And I said, "No, of course not." And she said, Why do you think things are so shit?" And I was astonished, because it was like hearing the Queen or the Queen Mother swearing. And we started to talk, and she said, and it completely coincided with what I'd been thinking, which was, why is it that we live in this beautiful place, but our politicians don't seem to tell the truth? They don't seem to solve problems. They create them. Nothing quite works the way it used to be. It's not just nostalgia for some misremembered past, but things are not going very well. And I thought, that is a very good question, and I haven't got a very good answer. And I hope by now, having thought about it for the past, it was 2 years, I have got a better answer, or at least series of answers, and I can frame some of the challenges for Britain in a different way that we might be able to solve them, because actually most of us want to do that.
I think everyone wants to want Britain to be the best country it can be. Everybody's got a different idea of how that might look in the future. Everyone has different priorities, I suppose. But this narrative that has developed, and I think it is all too accurate, even though I'd like it not to be, that nothing works anymore. Now, that may be an exaggeration, but in this last hour, you heard those last two calls there. I went on a rant about the National Highways people who seem to just want to make my life hell at the moment for whatever reason. And you think, why? And it's also not just, it's very easy to have a go at public services, and we all know the funding problems that many of them have. But it's also other aspects of our society now, and the way that we react to things. Our public discourse seems to be of a totally different nature than it was when you and I were growing up. And it's so easy to whinge, isn't it? And that's what I will admit, that when I saw your book title, I was really fearful that it would be, isn't Britain terrible because of Brexit? But it's not. I haven't finished it, but having read most of it, it's not like that, actually.
No, and let me put it another way. I think you're right. I mean, potholes. The small
government is spending £2.5 billion on potholes.
Potholes. The NHS, not being able to get a dentist on the NHS and so on. So, but leaving that...
To be fair, that's always been the case.
That's always been the case. But leaving that aside for a moment, look at it the other way. One university in the United Kingdom, Cambridge, has more Nobel Prize winners than any country in the world except the United States and Britain itself. So we're smart. We are not stupid. We do solve problems. Our creative industries, for example, it's not just that, everybody from Adele to even The Who would tour the world and people would turn up anywhere to see them. Our writers, Tolkien, J.K. Rowling, Ian Fleming, the three biggest franchises, or three of the biggest ones in Hollywood, are British writers. So we're good at lots of things. But there's a catch. When it comes to fixing our politics to make things work for people, we are so divided because of the peculiarities of the British system. The two-party system is very weird. And we don't have a two-party system. We've got lots of parties, but the elections, for example, only benefit two parties, Labour and the Conservatives, who tend to alternate in the government. And I started to look
but that's always, it hasn't always been the case, because prior to the Labour Party only came into existence at the beginning of the 20th century. But there's always been a two-party system. This is not something that is a recent phenomenon, is it?
No, but we have got many more parties now. And we have devolved power to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And the Conservative Party doesn't really represent any of those parts of the United Kingdom. There are odd patches, but there's no local council anywhere in Scotland run by the Conservatives. So we have a very strange system, but worse than that, I think, it's not the people, it's not some strange politicians who get into power. It's that we are very complacent about our political system as being, quote, the envy of the world, everything from global Britain to levelling up and all these slogans that we've had. And it's not just one political party. But the system which produces political leaders is actually a bit of a joke around the world. 5 prime ministers since 2016. This is extraordinary. This is the sort of thing you and I used to say, that's what Italian governments are like.
Well, up to a point, but there have been periods in our history when we've had multiple prime ministers within a very short time. Admittedly, not in the 20th century.
Not quite as many.
Well, in the 1920s, there were 3 general elections in 3 years. You had 2 different prime ministers. In the 1830s, there were several. So, it's not wholly unprecedented. It's just because it hasn't happened in our lifetimes that we think it's odd.
But there's a difference. The difference is that we still think, as I quote, for instance, Henry Tizard, who was a government advisor after World War II, he said, "The United Kingdom remains a great nation, but we have essentially the delusion that we are a great power. As long as we keep talking like that, we won't even be a great nation, because it pushes us to think how the British system is perfect. It's not."
I don't see this whole idea of British exceptionalism. I get it, but I've never been really convinced that it's as prevalent as people seem to allege. There's a lot of myths about this country that sometimes we play up to. I remember when I was teaching in Germany, and teaching German kids English. And they all seem to be under the, I think, misapprehension. I suspect you might think they were right, that, and this was early 80s, Britain was still in search of a role after empire. And I think we are in search of a role at the moment, but I don't think it's got anything to do with empire. It's because we've made this decision to come out of the European Union. So inevitably, if you come out of a bloc that you've been in for 40 years, that is going to lead to a lot of debate about what Britain's role should be. But this idea that we somehow think that we're better than everyone else, I don't.
No, we don't. Most of us don't think that. We do think, quite rightly, we are still a great nation, although even within the British nation, there are all kinds of bits that are pulling apart. But we have had traditionally let me put it another way. We are full of, it seems to me, weaponized nostalgia. You don't do it, and I don't do it.
Oh, no, I do. I love a bit of nostalgia.
Really?
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
I'll give you an example. Jacob Rees-Mogg goes on and on and on about restoring demetricating Britain and going back to old weights and measures. There is no country in the world, none, that has the same weights and measures as we do. The Americans don't have it. They have gallons, but they're different. An American gallon's 3-point-something litres, a British gallon's 4-point-something litres.
They do have Fahrenheit, though.
They do have Fahrenheit, but the point is that we have a kind of a politics which says, look over there. That's something important. Let's pay attention to this. Let's have a look at metrication rather than the real problems that you were talking about earlier.
I would not go back to the systems, because virtually everybody who's an adult now has grown up with all of it. Why would you want to go back to it?
But why is it part of our political discussion?
Well,
it comes up all the time. Putting the crown back on beer glasses. It's never been banned on beer glasses. It's just silly.
But the use of non-metric weights was banned. Now, I'm thinking, well, if somebody wants to sell things in pounds and ounces, I mean, does it really matter? I mean, just let them.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, most people will still operate by kilograms and pounds and whatever now. But if somebody really wants to use those, I don't see the problem.
No, but the problem is that this is part of the politics of distraction. We have real problems which real politicians could solve, but they're difficult, and they don't quite admit they're difficult, so they say, look over there, there's something that we can do. We had Grant Shapps suggesting during one of his 5 jobs in the past year or so that one of the things as Transport Secretary he was looking at was too many tannoy messages on trains. I'll tell you the problem with trains. Not enough trains that go on time because people are on strike. So that's part of the problem, but there are solutions.
You talk a lot about the political system in this country, which, I mean, everyone would admit that there are faults in it. But and given what's happened over the last few years, especially with 3 prime ministers within the same year, inevitably people think, well, the system must be broken. But I would submit to you that actually the defenestration of Boris Johnson in the end, and the fact that Liz Truss only lasted 49 days, that actually shows that the system is working.
Not quite, I think. I think the system.
I didn't think you'd agree.
I think the system works in some ways. I think, for example, and I talked to Anthony Selden on the day that Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II the funeral was taking place, and we had a very long discussion. And what was remarkable was that we changed our head of state and our head of government in the same week, and nobody got killed. There were maybe a few people who protested about the king or something, and very, very little happened. The only gunfire was to celebrate King Charles II. Now, that's remarkable. But at the same time, we have had revolving prime ministers who are not selected by you and me, unless you happen to be a member of the Conservative Party and you pay £2.09 a month, which is 2.5 Mars bars, to be able to select Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, if you're allowed, by other members of the Conservative Party, who are called MPs, who make up the rules as they go along. Now, this is a very, very silly way to run a country. And it's not just true of the Conservatives, it's true of Labour as well. And most of us are not members of political parties.
Oh, but that's part of the problem.
Maybe
why would you join? Be.
Why? What? Compulsory?
Well, no, obviously I don't believe in compulsory party membership. I don't believe in compulsory voting. But the fact is, if people don't involve themselves more in the political process, you get the politicians you deserve.
Yes, and I say exactly that. And the politicians we deserve happen to be, out of 57 prime ministers, 20 went to Eton, one school, and out of 57 prime ministers, 30 went to one university, Oxford. So it's a bit of the shallow end of a talent pool. That doesn't mean that old Etonians and Oxfordians should be banned, but this is very odd. So we do get the politicians we deserve, because we need to change the system to enable us to have some kind of coherence, not based on weird traditions. Like, for another example is the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, we've had Deputy Prime Ministers going back to Clement Attlee, who deserved the job because it was time of war and so on. But some have an important role, some don't. We just make up.
Some prime ministers don't have them.
And some prime ministers don't have them, and they're not missed. They're not missed, are they? So what I'm saying is that the flexibility of the British system is one thing, but things which are flexible can be bent. Boris Johnson did a bit of bending, but if we had somebody less indolent and more ideological and more nasty than him, we could be in real trouble, because the executive, the prime minister, is in charge, and there are very few checks and balances.
Oh, I think there are lots of checks and balances, and you see the House of Lords, which you talk about a bit. I mean, that is, I would say, a classic example of where nobody really knows what to do because it actually does the job it's supposed to do. It's a revising chamber.
200 members of it do. The other 600 members are a waste of space.
You and I would not invent the House of Lords in the way that it is now. We absolutely wouldn't. And I do want to see it reformed so that they're either wholly or predominantly elected. But sometimes I do think, well, be careful what you wish for, because if you then have a second chamber that is competing with the first chamber, I'm not sure that's going to improve our political system.
Sure. But look at it a different way. There are only 2 national legislatures anywhere in the world where, for example, members of the state religion are there of right.
Yeah,
and one is Iran and one is us. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with bishops, they're great. There's nothing wrong with lots of members of the House of Lords. I happen to know quite a few, and they are terrific. But the system is ridiculous, and the House of Lords is the low-hanging fruit. That's the one that's easy to reform.
Is it?
Well,
think of all of the attempts that there have been, and very few of them have done anything.
It's much easier to get public interest in doing something about it. Let's put it that way. And you're right, because it is a useful dustbin for prime ministers who want to reward cronies, friends, and donors. That's why it's, in one sense, is easier than tackling the real problem, which is the way we elect members of parliament.
Well, we'll come on to that in a minute. Now, we're going to do something now which is anathema to you, Gavin, because you've never done it in your long broadcasting career. We're going to go to a commercial break. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:21. Gavin Esler is here. Famous broadcaster. You will have all seen him on Newsnight for how long did you do? 11 years was it you were on Newsnight?
I think so. Well, I was a Newsnight as a reporter, and then I went to America, and then I came back. So I can't remember. It's a long time ago.
I remember you interviewing me on Newsnight once. It was a very delicate interview because it was the night that David Cameron announced his A-list of parliamentary candidates, and I wasn't on it. And I remember thinking, Newsnight phoned up and said, would I come on and talk about it? And I thought, well, this could be the end of if I say the wrong thing here. And I got permission from them to do it because I said, look, if I don't do it, they'll get somebody who's like to shout their mouth off, that outrage that they're not on it. And you were brilliant because you didn't sort of try to go for a gotcha headline and also ridicule me, which you could easily have done because I wasn't on the list. But I remember walking out of there thinking, I think I got away with that.
Well, you see, that was my problem. I should have got you, shouldn't I? No, you were lost. But you know what? That's a very good point, because one of the things I say in the book is I have interviewed senior politicians all over the world, and I've only had one say, I don't know the answer to that. And the reason they don't say that is because they know the next question is, what do you mean you're whatever you are? And the one who said it was David Miliband. And he said, it was Libya, I think it was. I don't know the answer to that. And he went up in my estimation because that was really difficult. He didn't go with the bland, bluffing stuff. And neither did you. So that's why we get on.
Right. Charlie in Belfast says, many warm greetings to Gavin from former BBC colleague Charlie, friend of Gavin's producer Don. It's all very in this, isn't it? I remember Gavin's TV journalism in BBC Northern Ireland with enormous respect. It was vital, informative, profoundly investigative and always honest and truthful. But in keeping with the title of his book, BBC Northern Ireland is a withered, if not dying version of what it was when Gavin worked there, packed with hype and populist fluff. So sad. I mean, I know quite a lot of people that have worked in BBC Belfast, and I mean, it's a totally different journalistic job to, I suspect, anywhere else in the United Kingdom. I mean, do you miss that sort of rough and tumble of journalism?
I do. I miss Belfast. I'm going back there very shortly. I love Northern Ireland, and I have many, many friends there in both communities. And in fact, one of the stories that means the most to me was in that era about a man called Giuseppe Conlon, who was one of the 6 supposed IRA bombers to do with the bombing campaign in London. He was innocent and another 5 were. And I was something like 24 or 25. And it was obvious. I talked to his family. I talked actually to the IRA and said, is he one of yours? And they said, no, for obvious reasons, because he was a very sick old man and various other things. And I did a programme about it. And eventually he was pardoned posthumously. He died in prison. And the other people in his supposed bomb factory were all finally released. It was an extraordinary moment because I'd never thought that British justice would be so bad. And it was really bad. And it was bad because we were all scared. We were all scared of the IRA bombing campaign, which I loathed. I thought it was terrible. But that doesn't mean you should lock up innocent people. And I feel very strongly about things about Ireland. I feel very strongly, for instance, that we're not taught that the United Kingdom lost 22% of its landmass at the end of World War I when Ireland seceded. Because if Scotland goes from the UK, that'll be 32% of our landmass. So people in England are not somehow immune from all this.
We know nothing virtually in this country about Irish history. And
nothing.
It's absolutely shameful that it's not taught in schools. I mean, I know you could spend the whole school curriculum teaching history because there's so much of it to learn. But last year, I suddenly thought to myself, I really don't know anything about the Republic of Ireland and how. I knew that there'd been a civil war. I knew about the Easter Rising, but that was about it. And I then decided to do a podcast series on all the different Taoiseachs, or Taoiseach as they're called, in Ireland. And I found academics, politicians, journalists to interview about them all. And it's now being turned into a book because there are so many people. And I was thinking, why hasn't anyone in Ireland done this?
Yes.
They are fascinated with us in a way that we're not fascinated with them or their history. And I think it's partly a guilt complex.
Yes, I think it is.
That's why we don't know about it.
And it's also a defeat. It was a defeat of the British state at the end of a glorious, pretty horrible fight in World War I. But Ireland decided to leave, and it left because of 50 years previously where we dithered about actually giving Ireland a better deal. And that's exactly what I fear that we're doing now. We'll dither for decades and things will fall apart because we're not actually paying attention. It happened with Ireland then. And actually, it's quite interesting. If you saw the film The Banshees of Inisherin, which did very well, an Irish film, most of the British critics didn't get it was actually not just a comedy about 2 guys who don't get on living on an island. It was about the Irish Civil War, about somebody cutting off his fingers because he couldn't get on with somebody he'd otherwise liked. And it was a very profound piece of art produced by Ireland, which left, I think, British audiences a bit bewildered.
Now, we haven't mentioned the B word so far. At least I don't think we have. I think I may have done, but I think I got away with it. I've sort of pigeonholed you in the past, maybe unfairly, as somebody like Alistair Campbell and Andrew Adonis suffering from Brexit derangement syndrome. Have I been unfair in that?
Well, I think so. I think the derangement has been to the country. It's not been to me. But I tell you, I've travelled a lot since the Brexit vote in 2016. And I have to say that people I know in foreign countries who love Britain for various reasons think we've gone a bit queer, a bit mad, a bit odd in the head. They think, what's gone wrong with these people? I have got a relative in Hamburg, or near Hamburg, who's a doctor and who studied in England. And after the Brexit vote, I was having a beer with him in his garden. And he said to me, can you explain Brexit to me? And I tried to do, I think, a reasonable job and say, actually, there was a real problem. There was a particular problem for David Cameron that 3.8 million people voted for UKIP and he wondered what to do about them. And then, although Europe was never a salient issue, it became one because of UKIP, and Nigel Farage did a very good job in doing that. And I went on and on and on, and Bruno was looking at me as if I was daft. And I said, Bruno, you're not getting this. You're a doctor, you studied in England, you love England, you tell me why Brexit happened. And he said, deadpan German face, well, I think the English had a headache. So you shot yourselves in the foot. You still have a headache, and now you can't walk. And I have been trying to beat that definition for a long time. And that doesn't make me a Ramona. I mean, I just think if you make mistakes, you should finally say, did we get what people really wanted out of this? Is anybody really happy? And what's funny, I think is funny anyway, is that we've gone from the sunlit uplands and the global Britain free to make its own way in the world to people complaining about some people at the proms waving around EU flags. I mean, is that it? Is that what we're at?
To be fair, they did that before Brexit as well.
They did it before Brexit as well. If they did American flags, I don't do flags. I'm sorry, I don't really care about flags. But I'm simply saying that this is a big moment for our country.
It is.
And I think we've got it wrong, and we've got to realise that.
Well, it's quite something to say that the biggest popular vote was wrong. 17.2 million people voted for this, far larger than any other referendum or general election vote.
But on a premise of 16 words. All the other referendums, the Good Friday Agreement, 35-page document, this is what peace looks like. Do you want it or not? The 1975 referendum, Mrs. Thatcher, quite rightly, was very suspicious of referendums. But even in 1975, people were voting for the status quo. We know what it's like being in the European Economic Community. We agree. 2011, another referendum, this time on alternative voting system. Not a method that I would choose, but anyway, people again voted for the status quo. They knew this was the only one where they voted for a leap in the dark. And we weren't allowed a second referendum to say, do you know, this deal that you've come up with, Boris, or Liz or Theresa May, of which the Theresa May deal, I think, was the best of the three. This deal, we're going to vote for it as people who know what it is now. We didn't know that.
No, we didn't do it that way. And I think there were flaws in the way that it was done. For example, should you have a referendum on a major constitutional issue on a 50-50 basis? So you just need 50.1%. Now, in 79, Callaghan on Scottish devolution, I'm trying to remember the details there. I think it had to be, was it 40% of the electorate had to...
There was a number that had to vote and then a number...
in America, which people often look towards America for sort of guidance in these things, given their constitutional arrangements, you have to have a 66% majority in the Senate to make a constitutional amendment, I think.
Yes, that's right. And you also have to have all the state, within the states as well, you have to do things. But it's set out.
But as maybe you know more about this than I do, but I don't remember that being an argument in the run-up to that referendum. No. I don't remember anybody on the Remain side ever saying, no, it should be 60%
no, because
or 66%.
The Remain side was so complacent. David Cameron thought they were going to win, and actually most people thought they were going to win. And I was in Scotland at the time, and I thought Remain would win because Scotland, it was 60-something% in favour. But the reason that's salient in the book, I don't bang on about Brexit, but I do bang on about the way in which that vote happened and how we don't have a system beyond letting the Prime Minister decide what we're voting on, when we're voting on it, what it will say, 16 words, and then saying, or his successors saying, well, we said it was advisory, but it's now actually going to be compulsory and binding. And that is something Edmund Burke and Margaret Thatcher and many Conservatives hate.
I mean, we don't have a tradition of referendums.
No, and we shouldn't have, actually. Sorry to interrupt.
And we don't have a tradition of coalitions. I mean, Disraeli once said England does not love coalitions. I'm not sure he quite meant it in the Nick Clegg sense of the coalition. But so, I mean, you and I can agree that the way the referendum was configured was flawed. I totally agree with that. But as the old saying goes, we are where we are. We were where we were in June 2016. And I don't think any government could have ignored that vote and decided, well, actually, we've had the vote, but it wasn't. I mean, people kept saying, it's only an advisory referendum. Well, that wasn't the impression that we were given. We were told that if people voted in favour, we would be out. So what came afterwards, again, we can probably agree, was, an unholy mess.
Yes.
But I would still say that it's not. I do not regret voting Leave. And if there was a referendum tomorrow, I would still vote Leave, despite what a lot of my listeners seem to think, even though I can see that there have been big difficulties following that referendum. And the reason I say that is because it's not my fault that today's current crop of politicians have let us down and they haven't made the most of Brexit. Now, you might say, well, that's a pretty lazy argument, and it may well be. But we've had the opportunity to do so. We still have the opportunity to do so, actually. But I don't have any confidence looking at this current crop of politicians that they have the faintest idea how to do that.
Well, I agree with that. But do you agree that if you have a vote, I'm very hostile generally to referendums in a country which has no tradition of them and no real tradition and doesn't actually say how they've got to be operated. Ireland has a tradition of it. It's in the constitution. But do you agree that having happened, a wise government would say, we're going to get the best deal we can and we'll give you a second chance to vote as to whether you agree with the deal or not.
But
Because
then
then
what
you're voting
happens
for
if you
reality.
don't agree with the deal?
Well, then it doesn't happen.
That's a bigger problem. Listen, the conversation has been so fascinating. I've just looked at the time and I'm 5 minutes late for the news, and that's a sacking offence at LBC. So if we don't want me to lose my job, I think we'd better go there, hadn't we? It's 8:35 news headlines with Darragh Jackson.
The number of people now known to have died from floods in the Libyan city of Derna has risen to 11,300. Local authorities say another 10,000 people are still missing after dams protecting the area collapsed. Hunter Biden, the son of the US president, has been indicted on gun charges in Delaware. 2 counts are tied to him allegedly filing a form claiming he was not using illegal drugs at the time he purchased a revolver in October 2018. And the boss of the John Lewis Partnership has told LBC shoplifting has become an epidemic. Dame Sharon White has confirmed they are putting in extra money to ensure better protection from the police. LBC weather, rain becoming heavier in Northern Ireland and Northern England and Southern Scotland. Dry and mainly clear elsewhere with a low of 5 degrees.
This is LBC. This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
Time is really running away from us. I should have encouraged you to phone in if you want to talk to Gavin, and you can still do so. We've still got another 22 minutes to go. 0345 6060 973. Guy in East Dulwich has done just that. Hello, Guy.
Ian, hello.
Hi, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that in Greek mythology, people who were guilty of hubris were then punished by the gods, and I think that's what happened to us. I think we went 60 or 70 years with the myth that we had won the war alone, and I think this had influenced the Brexit vote. There were people of my parents' generation phoning into LBC talking about the war and talking about Germany, and I think that there were a lot of people in this country who were jealous that Germany had won the peace, and I think that influenced the Brexit vote. And that's what, and I also think that it was that mentality which led to British or English exceptionalism. And the truth is, yeah, we did win the war, but with the help of the Russians, the US, Brazilians, the French, the Greeks. There was a whole list of countries who had declared war on the fascist state.
I was going to answer that, but Gavin's here to do so.
Well, no, you can as well. But I think, hi, good evening, Guy.
Hello, Gavin.
I think hubris is a very important word in politics of the West since particularly the 1990s. I remember, and I'm sure you do too, that it was the triumph of democracy. Lots of countries that had previously not been democracies, including Spain and Greece and others, were democratic. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the belief in a unipolar world, the belief that democracy was the only way forward, and we're now in a kind of democratic recession. And we have votes, and we have the Brexit vote, but they're ill thought out. And that hubris and thinking, harking back too much to the past. I love our traditions, but I don't want to live in the past. And I think we've got to actually think slightly differently about how we reinvent ourselves for the future. And part of it is we misremember, as you said, Iain, even the history of Ireland as attached to us. So we forget, for example, that of course, I mean, my father fought in the war and was a Dunkirk veteran. I can't tell you how much he hated people talking about the Dunkirk spirit as if it was a victory. It was, we got our men back home, luckily, but it was a failure because we didn't think that the Germans would do certain things. And hubris is a real problem in our politics even now, it seems to me.
It is. The only thing I would say, guys, I think it has become almost a national sport to do our country down. And I think if you look at the real history of World War II, Britain did stand alone for a time before America came in. You're absolutely right. There were many other countries that helped the victory, the Soviet Union, America being the two most important. But if Britain hadn't stood alone at that time, if we had capitulated, as many politicians were advocating that we should and come to some sort of peace agreement with Hitler, we would be living in a very, very different world now. And I think sometimes we need to think on that a little bit.
That's true. But, we had ideas in the 1930s that appeasement was a good idea. And we reversed that,
and I
thankfully.
often think, well, where would I have been on that argument?
Yeah. Well, I think this is very interesting too, because I think it was a perfectly reasonable thing to do not to want to fight Germany again.
Yeah.
And then suddenly we woke up. And I think that is what happens in Britain. Suddenly we wake up. It happened with the Corn Laws. It happened with Germany. And maybe, you never know, it might happen with Brexit.
Controversial. Chris is in Croydon. Hello, Chris.
Yes, hello. Yes, good evening, Gavin. Good evening, Ian. Yes, look, my point is, Gavin, in advocating EU membership, you're saying that to belong to a trading bloc, as the EU essentially is, we should be also prepared to progressively surrender our democracy, which is also an aim of the EU, is ever closer union. It's written in their constitution, it's in their headquarters in Brussels. Ever closer union means ever closer democracy. And that is unacceptable. I think, as John Foster Dulles said of the unlovely Nicaraguan dictator, Formosa, sure he's an SOB, but he's our son, SOB I don't like our politicians, but at least I elect them.
Sure, but the problem for the EU, if it is ever closer union and it's becoming one unit, that's their problem. My book is about our problem. And our problem is we make problems for ourselves. We make them because we don't think through what we're trying to do. And we try to solve, for example, a problem by having a referendum on 16 words, which we don't know what it means. And that's just one of many, many of these problems that we end up creating more difficulties for ourselves than we do in the past. So for another question, which was never raised before the referendum itself, was how can you tell the people of Scotland in 2014 that the only way to stay in the European Union is to stay within the United Kingdom, and 2 years later they're out of the European Union because of English votes, which the people of Scotland didn't vote for. And the same's true in a slightly different way for Northern Ireland. So we just didn't think it through, and that's the problem.
I've never quite fallen for that argument because this was a national referendum, a UK-wide referendum. And I think, in a sense, you could say the mistake they made was to actually count the votes separately in the 4 different countries.
Well, that's one way of looking at it.
And even in Scotland, 38% did vote to leave. Even among SNP supporters, there was quite a substantial minority vote. I think it's 33% voted to leave. So people nowadays trying to make out that Scotland almost had a unanimous vote in favour of remaining. It actually didn't.
Every one of 32 electoral districts voted to remain.
I get that. And it was a clear majority. You're absolutely right.
But the resentment is real.
Yep.
And the resentment is important. And the same is true in Northern Ireland, where people say, wait a minute, my background is Protestant, Ulster. Ulster Protestants have said to me, hold on a minute. We and our families have spent years trying to oppose having a border between the United Kingdom and where we are, and Boris Johnson conceded it in a meeting with Leo Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach, on the Wirral. So we have botched it, and I think we agree it's been botched, but it's been botched in a way which alienates different groups of people in different ways. They're not Ramonas in Northern Ireland, the Protestants, who fear for their future, who fear they've been betrayed. You can disagree with them and so on, but they had something which was very important, which has been taken away.
Now, if you live in the area of Gloucester and you think, I'd really like to hear Iain Dale and Gavin Esler talk more about this sort of thing, well, you can do so tomorrow night at the Gloucester History Festival. History Festival. Was it 8 o'clock?
8 o'clock or 8:15
Just go to their
9:15,
website and you can burgeon the audience. Tickets may have sold out for your event. I don't think they have for mine because I'm doing one before that as well. Anyway, enough of the plugging. We'll come back to your calls and more from Gavin Esler in just a moment. It's 8:46.
LBC Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:49 is the time on LBC. Gavin Esler is here talking about his book, Britain is Better Than This. Quite an endorsement on the front. Will Hutton says the most compelling, lacerating description of the Muppet show that is British public life I have yet read. Well, wait till you read James O'Brien's new book in November. That may even outdo that description. I don't know. We'll soon see. Now, let's go to another call. It's Duncan in Romford. Hello, Duncan.
Hello.
Hello. What would you like to say?
What I wanted to say is that I agree with one of the earlier contributors who said that the problem with the EU is that in order to preserve a trading arrangement, we've had to enter into a political union. And the way we entered into political union was not, in my view, was not proper democracy. Every other country that joined the European Union, I believe I'm right, I could be wrong, every other country that joined the European Union had a referendum in advance in which people were asked, do you want to be in the European Union? They had a chance to vote yes or no. And I believe we're the only one that didn't have a referendum in advance because they said, oh, well, it's not part of our normal constitution. It wasn't part of our constitution because a situation hadn't arisen in which a referendum was required, but this was one which did.
But we did have a referendum in 1975 on staying in or not, and we did vote decisively to stay in.
But that was not the European Union, that was the common market. And
True.
It wasn't sold to people on the basis of it being a political union, but on the fact that it was a big trading opportunity. And in fact, that same year, an opinion poll said that if people had been asked if they wanted to be in a political union, they would have voted no. I don't know whether that's true or not, but people did in practice draw a distinction between the two. And we didn't enter into the European Union until, I think, the Treaty of Maastricht, which would have been in the 1990s.
Well, I think the thing is, I'm not actually very interested in the problems of the European Union at all. I'm interested in the problems of the United Kingdom and the way we take decisions and the way we do things. So my book isn't about the EU. It's about the way in which Britain is governed and the way in which we don't have a simple operating manual to tell us, for instance, who exactly does what, exactly how referendums should or should not be conducted. We just make it up as we go along, and that leaves us open to abuse. So Brexit is just one example of things in which we have done something where we make it up as we go along, but there's plenty of other examples. There's plenty of other questions like, for example, to lose one ethics advisor may be unfortunate. To lose two sounds like carelessness, as Boris Johnson did. He was the boss of the ethics advisors, effectively. How the House of Lords works, how the devolution settlement simply allows people in Scotland to say it's all Westminster's fault, and people at Westminster suggest that the Scots are being too greedy. We haven't really thought it through. We muddle, but we don't muddle through. And the muddling has got to stop. It's rather like Parliament itself. Westminster is literally falling apart. Bits are falling off it. And it happened before in Victorian times in 1838. Much of Parliament burned down because it hadn't been properly maintained. We are doing the same with our political system. We think, or we sometimes think, that it's all fine, and some people think it's the mother of parliaments. Well, the mother doesn't have many children who actually copy exactly the way we do things. And that's what I'm trying to suggest, that what we need to do is think, not get distracted, to think about how we vote, to think about how we can act together, and to think about why it is we're so successful in so many things, but our political system is failing us. And that is, to me, the real problem. It's not about whether the European Union is or is not a superstate or whatever. It's about us, not them.
And of course, it's England that's the mother of parliaments, not Westminster.
Yes, and of course, it was the English constitution that Walter Bagehot wrote. It was not the British constitution.
Indeed.
And of course, Lord Macaulay called it pure gold. So we have got these very strange ways of phrasing what's supposed to be a complicated United Kingdom for the 21st century, harking back to things that were written about in the Victorian times.
Can I just ask you a bit about the BBC? Because you spent most of your career working for the BBC. When you look at the state of the News and Current Affairs Department of the BBC now, do you sort of shake your head in despair?
I have to say, I don't watch a lot of television. I watch very little television. I watch some on catch-up. I listen to Radio 4 in the mornings. Sorry, but I do. I listen to the Today programme.
Some people do, apparently.
Some people do, and I think it's great.
Not against the law.
I watch the odd TV news bulletin, but mostly I catch up with stuff online. I read a lot and so on. So I'm not a great authority. I did think it was very odd that there would be a merger between a BBC News channel dedicated to Britain and one dedicated to people abroad, because you've got a simple problem then. If the Lionesses had won, the World Cup, that is the biggest story in the world for a British audience. It may not be if there's, I don't know, floods in Libya or Pakistan or whatever. So balancing those two seemed to me a very odd decision by ramming them together. I didn't understand that.
Newsnight is reportedly facing £5 million worth of cuts to its budget. That's 55% of its budget. And they're talking about axing all of the correspondents and basically making it a panel show. Now, I think that would be an appalling thing for Newsnight. You might as well axe the whole programme.
Well, I think, what's the point of that, really?
To save money.
Because there are plenty of... One of the things I find rather dispiriting is that when I go to book festivals, you get audiences of 300, 400 people, and actually they've got completely different views, but they want to do as we're doing, which is disagreeing quite a bit, but also agreeing quite a bit and thinking about things and maybe changing our minds. A lot of panel shows are constructed on the basis that you think A, I think B, we're going to have a fight and that's going to be great. Newsnight is not like that. Sometimes it is, because it's quite a vast canvas. But if all it ends up with is four of the usual suspects who are pulled in because they represent views A, B, C and D, or four different political parties, I'm afraid I don't think I'll be watching it at 10:30, if that's what it is. But I don't know. I don't know the inside story.
That seems to be what they're discussing. Let's go to Ian in Bovey Tracy. Hello, Ian.
Oh, good evening to both of you. Yes, Gavin's response to an earlier caller about at the beginning of the World War II, that eventually we got our act together. Great minds think alike, because in his book, The Europeans, Luigi Barzani observed that the defining characteristic of the British was that they always leave things until it is almost too late. So I couldn't help but call up and comment on.
That's not necessarily always a bad thing, though, because if you jump in both feet first, sometimes you live to regret it.
That's true, although it's good not to make mistakes in the first place. I mean, it was Winston Churchill who said that the Americans always do the right thing, usually after having exhausted every other alternative. So we're not alone in this. No. I mean, we're not alone. I'm just trying to suggest that we need to have a strategic think. We're great at tomorrow morning's headlines. All the time we do this, but we're not very good at strategic thinking for the future. Macmillan did it in the 50s, and that took us into the European Union. But we're not doing it now. We're not really thinking beyond slogans what we want for this country.
I should say, Ian, you live in Devon. We're both at the Appledore Literary Festival on Saturday as well, if you haven't had enough of us by now.
That one is sold out, I have to.
Is it?
Yes.
I'm not sure mine bit of it is.
Well, I'll come along to yours.
Excellent. Are you optimistic about the future for this country?
I am. I'm optimistic about the people of this country because I meet so many of them, and we trust each other as a country more than most other OECD countries. I think more than any of the big ones. But we trust our governments much less. That tells you something. That tells you something about the good bits of the British people. If you drop your wallet, somebody might pick it up and give it to you back. I'm not guaranteeing that, by the way, but I think it's a possibility in this country.
Well, do you know what? He shall remain nameless, but somebody that I'm looking at the moment found 20 quid on the tube the other day and has handed it into the British Transport Police.
Well,
I wonder how many people would have done that.
I think quite a few, actually. I don't know. A wallet, I definitely think they would.
A wallet, yes.
Maybe 20 quid.
Possibly not. Gavin, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Gavin's book is called Britain is Better Than This. It's $18.99 and it's a big paperback, which you might think that's a lot for a paperback, but it's a fairly hefty one, and it's published by Head of Zeus. Thank you very much, and see you in Gloucester tomorrow.
Thank you, and see you tomorrow.
Now, in the next hour, we're going to be talking about something that I remember talking about a year ago, about whether too many GPs were over-prescribing antidepressants. Now, we have the news today that antidepressant prescriptions for teenagers have hit 1 million in a year for the first time. The number of children aged 13 to 19 using antidepressants rose by 6,000 in 2022 to 173,000. So I'm going to repeat that question. Do you think antidepressants are prescribed far too easily? But how hard is it to get any help for mental health which doesn't involve taking antidepressants? And have you struggled to stop taking them yourself? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the number of people killed in floods in the Libyan city of Derna has passed 11,300. 10,000 more are missing after heavy storms on Sunday night caused by 2 dams bursting. Anas Ligo-Marti is a director of the Libyan-based think tank Sadiq Institute and told LBC the disaster was preventable.
Those 2 dams that were rising for days ahead of what we knew was happening in Bulgaria, Greece and Turkey when this storm Daniel was moving through